Thank you for joining us today for the Charleston Conference presentation, Open Access at the Book Chapter Level, Challenges and Opportunities. My name is Jalea Swanson. I am an Acquisitions and Accounting section lead at the University of Colorado Boulder Libraries. So if you delve into any of the literature about book chapters as a form of scholarship, you will quickly discover a humorous yet persistent metaphor about authoring book chapters being akin to bearing one's work. I have put this quote up on the slide that's from Dorothy Bishop that says, "If you write a chapter for an edited book, you might as well write a paper and then bury it in the hole in the ground." This metaphor stems from an informal investigation that Dorothy Bishop, a professor of developmental neuropsychology at the University of Oxford, performed on her own research. In her exploration, Bishop found that when comparing citation counts of her journal articles versus book chapters, her book chapters received significantly fewer citations than her journal articles. So based on the outcomes of her investigation, she jokingly wrote this quote. "And this debate that no one ever reads your work if you publish within an edited volume or a book chapter is one of the primary reasons I became so interested in this topic in the first place. I'd long thought about my own work, having published 3 book chapters in edited volumes, 2 of which I question, like Bishop, whether anyone has ever read them. Yet the third has been and continues to be one of my most highly cited works, with the citations nearly double the follow-on journal article that accompanied the book chapter. So in addition, this book chapter was made available as open access shortly after publication. So I really started to question whether open access for book chapters in particular has a role to play in discovery, readership, and could be a really great benefit for authors considering publishing book chapters. Yet open access initiatives have primarily focused on journal articles or whole monographs as a format of scholarly publication. Considerations of open access for book chapters are relatively rare. And so this presentation looks at the landscape of open access book chapters, examining the challenges and opportunities for authors, librarians, and publishers. So before we go any further, let's first define the types of scholarly works we are discussing in this presentation. We are specifically looking at book chapters found within edited volumes. An edited volume is a type of book that is composed of a collection of chapters written by different authors with an editor or editors responsible for the overall organization and coherence of the volume, often with a unifying theme. On the screen, I have an example of a recently published edited volume, Scholarly Communication, Librarianship, and Open Knowledge, edited by Maria Bond, Josh Bollock, and Will Cross from ACRL Publications. I also have a snapshot of the table of contents. As you can see, while there are thematic similarities in this table of contents, most of the chapters have distinctive authors. And this book, I will note, is also available as a fully open access ebook. So if you'd like to explore the table of contents or the structure further, I've provided the link in these slides. So the benefit of this type of scholarship and scholarly communication is that different authors can reflect upon, further develop, and communicate with each other around a central topic or theme. And so that really makes book chapters unique in that they are written by different authors, yet within the book itself, there is a sense of communication and scholarly development going on within the book. But the challenge with book chapters in edited volumes is that their form and structure inhabit this liminal space of being not quite a book and not quite a journal article. So I've outlined a few of the features where book chapters are more like books, or where they're more like journal articles. So for example, some of the book features that book chapters have are: the chapter is one entity contained in a structure that comprises a whole book. In contrast, so journal articles, while they're part of issues and volumes, you can really pick and choose those articles, and that structure of having an issue in a volume isn't necessarily as important as the structure of the whole book. And then also, in terms of how they're published, often book chapters are in edited reviewed rather than peer-reviewed manuscripts. However, there is some peer review that does occur with book chapters. And then finally, each of the chapters can be thematically tied to the other chapters within the book. And that's really the key, is that one chapter isn't meant to stand alone, as it's thematically related to the other chapters in the book. But where it has more journal article-like features, is each chapter is often authored separately. And then similarly, the research is independent from research of other chapters. And so as we think about book chapters throughout, we can really see how the structure itself may present a problem in considering open access and other means of addressing book chapters in edited volumes. Moving on to talk a little bit more about open access. So in a 2019 report by the British Academy that was commissioned by the UK Research and Innovation Office to inform the future of open access policy in the UK and provide evidence for UK higher education funding bodies with respect to book chapters published in edited collections. They found that there was a need to bring book chapters into the fold of open access policy in the UK. So while book chapters and edited volumes were not necessarily found across all areas of research, there was significant use of book chapters, for example, in arts and humanities and in other disciplines. And in arts and humanities, a quarter of the research outputs were book chapters. So this still represented a fairly important form of scholarly communication for those disciplines. And then furthermore, in all disciplines, when a book chapter was the result of funded research, 3/4 of these were funded by one of the UK's research councils. So in the UK, research councils are similar to federal agencies such as the NSF or the NIH that fund research with public funding. The findings from this report and of research outputs in the UK suggest that book chapters and edited volumes continue to be a consistent and in some areas major form of scholarly communication. It can also be the outputs of government and taxpayer funded research. So as discussed on the previous slide, the findings from the British Academy report and others have resulted in updates to the OA policy in the UK that will mandate for book chapters and edited volumes starting January 1st, 2024, so right around the corner, that UK research and innovation funded research, including any from its constituents, the research councils, will be required to make the accepted manuscript version freely available as open access no later than 12 months from publication. While promising that book chapters are explicitly acknowledged, it is noted that an embargo on this form of scholarship persists, unlike that of the journal article, which is mandated to be made immediately available as OA in the UK. I find this really interesting, and so I want to think that's an area of further research and investigation on why an embargo may persist for this form of scholarship, as opposed to the zero embargoes that are on journal articles. Meanwhile, in the US, the Office of Science and Technology OSTP memo from August 2022 that provided guidance and strongly recommends all federal agencies develop policies on open access publications by December 31st, 2025. It includes a footnote about book chapters. So in that footnote, while peer-reviewed research articles and articles published in scholarly journals must be included in these new OA policies that the agencies are to develop, other forms of scholarship, including book chapters and edited volumes, may be included, meaning that some or many of the federal agencies might not address book chapters in their updated OA policies. While they don't have data on federally funded research outputs in the form of book chapters in the US, as is available in the UK, the acknowledgement of book chapters as a potential form of research output from federally funded research in the OSTP memo suggests that there is likely some amount of federal funds that ultimately result in the publication of a book chapter. Before we switch gears a bit, I wanted to pause to address this question. So why should we even care about book chapters in edited volumes as open access? First, as we've gone over previously, book chapters in edited volumes continue to be an important form of scholarship, and in some disciplines may comprise a decent chunk of scholarly output in that field. So we should not ignore these forms of scholarship when we consider the scholarly landscape. Secondly, some of these book chapters are the outputs of publicly funded research. And so as OA policies are being developed, particularly around publicly funded research, we should continue to consider book chapters as they are being created through the use of public funds. So we're now going to switch gears a little bit to look closer at some preliminary data on open access book chapters. I have a few questions for you in the audience for you to just think about before moving on to the next slides. So the first question is, have you ever published a book chapter in an edited volume? And then the second question is, was your chapter made of, if you have, was your chapter made available as open access? And then consider the reasons why or why not. So the reason I asked the previous questions was because I've done some preliminary research and analysis on open access book chapters within library and information science literature. I presume that most of you who are in the audience may be from or would publish in the field of library and information science. I specifically looked at a data set of edited volumes and book chapters published in the year 2015. I wanted to go back far enough so that these publications would have time to sort of germinate and solidify themselves in the landscape of discovery, citations, and so forth. And I sought to find out whether or not the chapters were available as open access via Google Scholar specifically. So please note that on the next slide, while I have these findings, they are preliminary because I'm still doing some additional data collection and analysis, which may result in some changes to the outcomes. So while I have facts and figures to present, there is some ongoing research continuing, and these are subject to change. So here are some of the preliminary findings that I have. I looked at a total so far of 1,496 book chapters. I think one of the most interesting findings that I've had is that 51% of these were not found in Google Scholar at all as a citation. And then 49% were found. So the high percentage of book chapters not found in Google Scholar raises concerns about the discoverability of book chapters. And it kind of goes back to that notion that publishing a book chapter is similar to burying one's work. So if it's not found in Google Scholar, then there is some concerns about whether readers are finding the book itself and then finding the chapter within that book to be able to read. So out of the chapters that were found, 33% were open access, which is awesome. But the vast majority, 67%, were not available as open access. So even within the field of library and information science, where we may have more knowledge of open access than other fields, particularly those in the arts and sciences or arts and humanities, our book chapters are not readily available as open access via a publisher or institutional repository. Other disciplines may have similar or lower rates of book chapters available as open access. So I think this really presents some opportunities that there is room to grow those numbers, particularly within our own field of making book chapters available, either as green or as gold OA. So thinking back to the question of why or why not you may have made a book chapter available as open access, I want to raise the question of whether part of that reason was simply confusion or lack of clarity on the matter from the publisher. So perhaps the low rate of OA availability in library and science literature from the previous slide is in part due to the challenges in navigating open access policies and practices as an author. For this presentation, I also did a very rudimentary look at the research outputs by the University of Colorado Boulder faculty in 2022. I found there are 269 total book chapters published by faculty in 2022. Of those, 160 came from the top 5 publishers, whereas the remaining 109 publications came from a total of 82 publishers. So for books and book chapters, there continues to be a very long tail of publishers in the market. While generally this is a good thing in comparison to the state of consolidation and mergers that are occurring on the journal side, the long tail presents significant challenge when trying to navigate OA policy and practices among all of these publishers. The top publisher, Taylor and Francis, for example, does have information on their website about open access that includes OA for book chapters. However, I will note that the link from the Taylor and Francis website redirected to a Routledge website, and for me raised a bit of question and a bit of confusion as to whether this policy extends to all Taylor and Francis imprints, or was this really only specific to Routledge. In addition, I just looked randomly at one publisher from the long tail on that list, the Teachers College Press, and I was unable to find any mention of open access, whether for books or book chapters, for authors on their website or within their author guide. While the top publishers may have more information and also more experience with open access from their journal side of the house, publishers in the long tail may have little experience with open access monographs or even less experience with OA book chapters. And so as an author, trying to navigate this and find out your publisher's background knowledge and policies and where they sort of stand on OA for a book chapter can be quite challenging. So even if publishers and authors are open to the idea of publishing book chapters as open access, there is a significant complication in the question of who pays. Taylor and Francis and Springer, for example, both have options for authors modeled on article processing charges for journal articles that allows authors to pay to make their chapter available as gold open access upon publication. However, like with hybrid journals, if only one author pays, and it is only that chapter and not the entire monograph that becomes available as open access. So for librarians, especially someone like myself, an acquisitions librarian, this sets off some red flags as it presents concerns about double dipping, where the institution may be funding the cost for both making that specific book chapter available as OA, but then also the library will be paying list price likely to purchase the entire monograph for the library collection. So if there is a desire for the entire book to be made available as open access, then who foots the bill? I think this is a even more complicated question than with journal articles, because we have multiple types of stakeholders in the game. So will it be the editor who is expected to come with the much more substantial funding source? Or will each author, upon chapter acceptance in the book, be expected to pay their way? And then in addition, edited volumes also often include invited authors to help with the prestige of a publication. Will the invited author be expected to pay for their own chapter? I think all of these questions about who pays lead to a lot of complications on how to consider a model for open access of book chapters. So I just wanted to recap some of these issues that we have around book chapters in edited volumes. So first, they continue to be an important and consistent form of scholarly communication in many disciplines. Second, some book chapters are the result of publicly funded research. And so the OA policies in the UK and US address, or at least acknowledge, book chapters. And I think we may start to see these policies fleshed out a little bit more in the future as particularly the UK starts to implement their policy on making book chapters available as OA after a 12-month embargo. The majority of book chapters, however, from library and information science literature were not even found in Google Scholar, whether behind a paywall or open access. And when found, the majority are still not available as open access. Navigating OA policies as an author is particularly challenging because of the significant long tail. And then the questions of who pays for the publication fees is much more complicated for open access book chapters than with other forms of scholarly communications because of the number of players that may be involved. And so these are all the challenges that have been discussed in the previous slides, but I will leave us with some room for opportunity, so it's not all a giant mountain to climb. So for opportunities, where do we go from here? For authors in the short term, I do think that encouraging green open access and depositing in an institutional or similar repository is a decent option in the interim. So while we have complications over who pays for making a book chapter available as gold OA and double dipping with libraries, I think that a green OA model is a great option, and it's a way to start to engage authors when there may be less information from publishers around these issues. And then for librarians, I think we do have, especially on the acquisitions and collection development side, I think we do have the opportunity to start engaging with the long tail of publishers and vendors on open access for book chapters and potentially for monographs as well, if the policies and practices are not readily available. So just from my own look at the long tail within the CU Boulder authorship, many of them, while there are a lot of those publishers, there's still publishers that are familiar to us, that we consistently purchase scholarly works from. And so I think we do have an opportunity and an existing relationship to engage in these conversations. And then for scholars and researchers interested in OA, I think there's a really great opportunity to do some further research into the question of whether publishing a book chapter as open access can increase discovery, to sort of combat that initial quote of burying your work. Open access may present an attractive option for authors who don't want their book chapters to go into readership oblivion. And then finally, for publishers and librarians together in forums like this, engaging in conversations about the sustainable business models for addressing making book chapters available as open access. So while there are a lot of complications in the question of who pays, I think there are opportunities for publishers and librarians to have these discussions and to start to consider what such a model looks like. So thank you, and that concludes the presentation today. And I hope that I will be able to speak more with everyone in the Q&A section that is to follow.